what do you have down on the Summer of Love?
We
Didn't talk about it all?
No, we only got to the end.
Okay. I think we talked a little bit, not Summer of Love, we talked about the Love Pageant Rally. Sorry, tell me a little bit about that, the Love Pageant Rally.
October 16th, 1966, there was like concert featuring Janis Joplin, and it was a peaceful protest against the banning of LSD in California.
Very good. And we'll talk more about the LSD scene a little bit later. We told you that approximately 3,000 people attended that particular concert, and then we talked about in the mid-1960s how unorganized the people of hate were, no leadership. So a group came up and tried to take the first leadership role. What were they known as, Alex? And they organized what, Emily? Which was a?
Storm that gave out free things.
Very good. Now, they gave out things like clothing and shoes and lodging and food and sometimes money on occasion. And where'd they get this money or these things, Mauricio? Where'd they get this stuff to give away free?
From the stores nearby that woman.
Yeah. Yeah. The local restaurants, grocery stores, hardware stores, etc. thought, since they weren't getting really anything out of these people because they were begging all the time anyway, that it might be better to donate some things so they could get kind of civilized to a point, maybe lead a normal life, and it would benefit them in the end. We talked about hippies becoming very dependent on drugs. We'll talk more about that in the next test material. They would be begging in the streets. This caused a lot of alienation of people who were longtime residents, and it just got kind of be a tough area. We didn't talk about that? Okay, well, I'll tell you that now. Basically what happened is, you'd like to think this was a peaceful, loving area, but a lot of negative elements got into hate, okay? And probably the most negative of the elements were drugs. And we're going to kind of cover that more in detail when we get into the next topic. But what happened is these hippies, these people who came to hate, became dependent on these drugs, and it got so bad they didn't have any money to buy these drugs, so they just began to beg in the streets for money. And that caused a lot of alienation from the people, not only that were longtime residents of that area, but who else was coming in that area to see what was going on? We just went to Washington, D.C. to see what was going on. Tourists. Tourists were actually going down to hate, and they'd have these tour buses, and some guy'd be at a microphone, and here's the famous, Hate Street, where all the hippies are here getting high. I mean, that's what they did. And so tourists had come in, and they got tired of getting begged for money. So did the longtime residents. So anyway, it became kind of a real tense time, and it began to kind of make its start to the end. Well, the beginning of the end, I think this is where we left off, the beginning of the end for hate was known as the Summer of Love. And that was considered the crowning moment of hate, the start of the beginning, or the beginning of the end, when things kind of went spiraling downhill. Now, this Summer of Love was going to take place at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Anybody been to San Francisco before? Have you been to the Golden Gate Bridge? So there's a big park right there, okay? And that's where this Summer of Love took place, was at the Golden Gate Park, right by the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Now, to best explain the Summer of Love, it was simply a celebration of love, completely devoted to pleasure. Okay? Now everybody has a different thing they consider pleasure. We'll talk about the different things that were considered. But the Summer of Love was simply a celebration of love, and it was completely devoted to pleasure. Okay? What might be some of the pleasures that people enjoyed there? Drugs. Very good. What else do you enjoy doing? Although it always sounds like this to me, it dances. Music, the listening of music, because there was performers there. So some of the pleasures were the use of drugs, the listening of music, probably the camaraderie of each other, and without being incredibly gross or graphic, people had no problem with free love, loving each other, so to speak, without much inhibition at all, or worry about who was witnessing such a thing. So it was a little bit of a love free-for-all, using drugs, listening to music, getting hooked up. I guess that would be your term these days, or whatever. at Golden Gate Park, and really no inhibitions at all, if you can catch my drift. Well, really this Summer of Love was the last major event for Haight-Ashbury, okay? By the fall of 1967, most of Haight-Ashbury had dried up, so to speak. People had either moved on or couldn't afford to stay there anymore, went and did some other things. So the counterculture movement in San Francisco really came to an end by the fall of 1967. And from the fall of 1967 to the present, this simply becomes a cultural part of American history. But for a period of time, for a year or so, this was absolutely the middle of the counterculture movement. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story. I was adopted. I was an only child growing up, adopted. I knew, my parents were very good about telling me that I was adopted from as young of age that I can remember understanding that. But my mother really never really wanted me to know, who I was, so to speak, until I was 18. And so, I could tell you a story to take the whole period. But anyway, basically what happened is I found out, I'll just tell you this story. So I'm a sophomore in high school, and I am out after a ball game. We had played a basketball game with a gal I was dating, and a friend of mine had a gal he was dating, and we went to this little cafe. And it was the four of us and some guy I'd never seen in my life, sitting in the corner. So we're eating and talking and visiting, and finally this guy said, "Hey Randy G," he said, "watched you play tonight, you did a really nice job." And I thought, well, that was nice, didn't know who the guy was. And he said, "Yeah, I've been paying attention to you and following your career and this and that quite a bit, to the point where it got a little bit uncomfortable, okay?" So finally I looked at the guy, I was a sophomore in high school, and I said, "Well, I don't know exactly who you are." And he said, "Well, I'm your father," which was a little weird, you know what I mean? But it didn't shock me because I knew, I was old enough to know that I had been adopted. So anyway, I didn't really know what to say, didn't say much. So anyway, I went back home, and my mother was furious because that family was not supposed to make contact with me until I was 18 and whatever. But anyway, make a long story short, it just kind of went away. And then when my mother died, and then my dad died, my dad felt it was important that I knew where I came from. I was 40 years old, because he was concerned about health issues and cancer and that, because he was getting ready to die of cancer. And so he handed me this unbelievably large stack of papers that I still have today that just was stuff my mother kept that was incredible. Come to find out, my father was quite a mover and a groover. Talk about dysfunction and dysfunctional. He was married 4 times, and there must be about 18 kids from his adventures. But I had one full sister, and the rest were all stepbrothers and sisters, I guess is the point I'm making. So anyway, as I met these people, I have a stepsister named Noxanne, who was an attorney's secretary in San Francisco, but she recently retired a couple years ago, moved to Arizona. But her and I were talking, she spent almost her entire time that Haight-Ashbury existed in Haight-Ashbury. So she had lots of stories. It's too bad I can't get her here because she'd tell you some things. But anyway, so it happens. And so there were a lot of people there. I think you'd be surprised if you got to people that are probably, in their 70s or maybe 80s that maybe were at Haight-Ashbury. So it was a very big cultural part of American history. And it's very unique if you can talk to somebody that was actually there. Okay, we'll move on then to Woodstock. I think you've all heard about Woodstock, haven't you? I actually have an original ticket from Woodstock. That was an unused ticket from this event we're going to talk about. It was printed but never used, okay? What's that?
I was saying there's a song called Woodstock.
Yeah.
I mean,
Who sings it?
I've heard about it, but it's Young Belly.
Oh, really? There's another song called Woodstock that Crosby, Stills, and Nash sings, actually. So that's good to know. Well, this event you know as Woodstock really wasn't called Woodstock. It was called the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. That was the official name of it. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair. So it was arguably probably the most famous event of the 1960s that tied in with the counterculture movement, without doubt. And it was deemed the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. And it took place in mid-August of 1969. It took place in mid-August of 1969. If you look at the ticket, it's August 15th of 1969. That's about as mid of August as you can get. And it took place in the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York. In the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York. Catskills, just like it sounds. Does anybody in your short history life know about how many people attended Woodstock? Anybody know? What would you think would be a good number? What? Close, about five to 600,000. Aaron is right. About 500,000 to 600,000 people estimated. They never did get a count, but there were a heck of a lot of people there. So it was attended by more than 500,000 people, maybe closer to 600,000. Anybody know what it was about? What happened there? I mean, what happened? What was it? It was a great big what? Rock concert. Yeah, various artists. Jimi Hendrix was there. Joan Baez was there, which you probably don't have any idea who some of these people are, but there were a lot of different artists there. Jimi Hendrix, probably the most famously known that you might know. I played the guitar left-handed, or right-handed guitar left-handed. Imagine that. But he was we'll talk about him again in music in the 60s. Well, here was the thing. You know, this was a small area as far as getting in and out. You'd have interstates getting into the Catskill Mountains in New York. It was basically one road, non-paved for the most part. You know, it's like you're driving up camping. Well, the roads going in and out finally got jammed. So for a 72-hour period, you were either in or out. You either got in and you were stuck there, or you never got in at all. But it got to the point that you have 500,000 to 600,000 people in this small area in the Catskill Mountains in Bethel, New York. With once you were in, you were in. You weren't getting out. It's kind of like you go to a sporting event. You go to the Casper Event Center to the state wrestling tournament. You probably don't park right next to the building because you'll never get out of there. You know what I'm saying? By the time everybody's leaving. Well, take that times about 100 or maybe 1,000, and that's what you had there. I mean, the roads were blocked. People just parked everywhere. So once you were in for a 72-hour period. So how about food and water? What type of food and water was available at Woodstock? Only what you brought in. So a lot of people probably thought, well, gee whiz, I'll get in here, and if I don't like it, I'll leave in 5 minutes. That isn't how it worked. It was kind of like a one-way deal. You got in, you didn't get out, okay? So the only food and water that were brought to the concert was they weren't selling concessions and all that type of thing. So basically you had food and water that you brought in, and if you weren't prepared and didn't bring a lot of food and especially water, you were there for 72 hours without, unless you could find somebody to share with you. Well, if you can imagine 500,000 people in a very small area and the possible dangers that were present, what do you think happened? Huh? Fights, disruption, riots, deaths, all that kind of stuff. Just a horrible situation. False. Not a riot. Not a example of violence worth noting, and no one was killed. Okay, so you got 500,000 people packed in this small area for 72 hours, and despite all the possible dangers you can imagine with no food or water other than what was brought in, there were no riots, no major violence, and no deaths. And it lasted 3 full days, 72 hours, police looking on. There were police there, okay, just making sure it didn't get totally out of control, which it didn't. Amazingly so. What did people do there? Same thing they kind of did at the Summer of Love, only, 100 times. Okay, that many more people. Now I have a book here if I can find it. I've loaned these out a little, and I'm going to show you probably the best example I can of the pre-life in Woodstock. I should have had this out a little sooner, but oh, there it is. All right, now these are a few pictures. This is the counterculture, maybe at its best, a little bit there. You can witness that picture a little bit. Everybody kind of see that? Okay. Here's a typical scene at these rock concerts. This one is in a rock festival in California, but it wouldn't be much different than Woodstock. This is kind of what the feeling was among what you could and couldn't do. At those particular, it's very common to see this type of thing. Okay. Here's Woodstock. right here. So you can kind of get an idea of how many people you can jam into a small area. And that really isn't a great photograph, to be honest with you. Here is Janis Joplin at Woodstock, right here. What's that? Here's Janis Joplin right here at Woodstock. And that's only real good pictures I got, but that kind of gives you an idea. You could Google Woodstock if you're interested in seeing what's going on and get all kinds of images and videos and whatever. So that was probably the crowning event of the 60s concerning the counterculture movement. What we're going to end up with today is I'm going to give you the dangers of the counterculture movement. Why the counterculture movement in America was so dangerous in the 1960s. Now, historians go back and think about the counterculture movement, and they believe that the counterculture movement in America was a dangerous time in our history for these three reasons. Okay? Historians believe that the counterculture movement in America was a dangerous time in our country's history for these three reasons. And I really want you to concentrate on these and think about it, because I think we're making a good point here. Okay? Number one, the number one reason why, not number one, but the first reason why the counterculture movement was dangerous is it promoted self-destruction. It promoted self-destruction. What do I mean by that? It promoted self-destruction. What's that? That could be part of it. They didn't take very good care of themselves. Did a lot of drugs that messed them up. What else? Why else would it be self-destructive? And I love my daughter to death. I got great plans for her. She's going to graduate from high school, and she's going to go to college, and she's going to be something special. And what she ended up being? Not what I expected. She ended up running away from home in high school, lived in a commune, had 3 children, and came back for me to fix the mess after this whole thing went away. That's an example. The best example I give you, many young lives were either lost or ruined as a result of counterculture. Okay? Right? Many young lives were either lost or ruined. People died. Died of drug overdoses. Died because they were on drugs, maybe wrecking their car. I mean, there's a million reasons you could die in this counterculture movement. Die of starvation. Okay? Have a baby. The baby dies because you can't take care of it. But what they mean by it promoted self-destruction is that many young lives were either lost or ruined as a result of the counterculture movement. I know someone in town that you don't know. And the reason I know this is because I've been married in this community for many years, who right out of high school, this girl got messed up in this type of thing, moved away to the points where the parents had to go get her forcibly and bring her home. And the gal has never been the same since, and she's probably 65 years old now. But that's what she did. And I've listened to the parents' story on that. And so it happened. It happened to people right here in our community. The second reason that the counterculture movement in America was so dangerous in our history is it increased social hostility across the United States. It increased social hostility across the United States. It increased social hostility across the United States. What do I mean by that? Increased social hostility. Social hostility. Don't overthink it. This thing turned out to be a hell of a mess, did it not? And whenever there's a mess, what happens? We start finger pointing on whose fault it is. And what happened is social classes began to blame each other. It's your problem. It's because of your social class. Who's the only social class that they didn't have a right to point the finger at? Think about our social classes. What? Lower class. They're the only ones that had no fault in this. And what happened is the upper class started blaming the middle class. The middle class started blaming the upper middle class. The upper middle class began blaming the lower class. And it really caused hostilities that I think we still feel today about, do we have our own opinions about social classes in this country? Oh, geez, that person's a low life. That person's an uppity, rich, upper class. This is where this hostility among social classes really started, was with the counterculture movement, okay? And in reality, the only social class at the time that could claim no responsibility would be the lower class. And guess who got blamed the most? The lower class, okay? That's how it worked. And the third reason why, and I think the most important reason why the counterculture was a bad time in American history, is it was simply bad in view of human nature. It was simply bad in view of human nature. What do I mean by it was simply bad in view of human nature? Anybody want to guess on that? Simply bad in view of human nature. What's the view of human nature? What's a four-letter word for the view of human nature? The norm, right? Okay, now think about this. I want you to think about this in general. What did young people concentrate on academically during this time? Other than maybe nothing. What were they interested in? Mythology, astrology, and religion. Now, no offense to any of those, but is that going to put a lot of bread on the table? Okay, what did they lose interest in? The four cores. So, young people didn't study the things that they really needed to be successful in life. And we'll define successful in life in a minute, okay? They didn't study math, science, English, social studies. They studied mythology. They studied religion and astrology, which aren't bad things, but there's not a lot of, I don't know how you make a living in mythology. I don't know, maybe you can write a book, maybe you can teach mythology in college. But compared to being in a field in the four cores, it's tough, okay? Now, another reason why this was so bad in view of human nature is young people were involved in things that weren't seen as what? From